Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jerry Scheid, and I bring you greetings from our Board of Directors. It's a real pleasure to see you all in person today and get back to face-to-face meetings after what seemed like an awfully long time on Zoom. Glad that we're moving this direction. Because we are still concerned about COVID, we're offering the box lunch today rather than the buffet that we've traditionally done, but we hope that we'll get back to our buffet meals very soon. Also, there are, as I'm sure everyone has noticed, masks available at the ticket table and hand sanitizer on everyone's table for your use. Also on the tables, as always, are cards for you to write any questions you may have for the Congressman. Hold up your card and it will be picked up and given to our moderator. And because City Club wants all its members to remain safe and healthy, please, if you haven't already done so, do get vaccinated. As always, we like to thank our sponsors before we begin our presentation. They include the Bank of Idaho, the Idaho Humanities Council, Floor Idaho, the Idaho National Laboratory, Idaho State University, and KISU FM 91.3. The support of these kind folks are what make our presentations possible. I do want to mention that if you wish to hear the presentation again, it will be available on KISU 91.3 at 7 p.m. The 16th of August. I would like to add one special thank you to our newest board member, Chad Hammond of IE Productions. Because of Chad's very generous help, City Club was able to offer virtual programs to our members during the pandemic. Thank you so much, Chad. Well, here's a word about our upcoming programs. In the coming months, City Club will be offering programs regarding the advanced reactor technology at the INL, the Community of Eastern Idaho, College of Eastern Idaho's future tech facilities, the State of City Planning in Idaho Falls, and some other very important topics. Please be sure to check your website for the dates of these presentations. Our moderator this afternoon is well known by, I'm sure, all of you in our community. She anchored at KPVI Channel 6 from 1977 to 1983, and then stayed home for a few years having 3 baby boys, and returned to work at KIFI Channel 8 in 1990. She recently retired and says she is already so busy that she can't figure out how to get everything done. She and our guest speaker go back a long way to when Congressman Mike Simpson was a city councilman in Blackfoot. She reminds Mike of this every time she needs a return call from his office. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's City Club presentation, Carol Honus.
Welcome, everybody. So great to see us again together. Not quite as packed together as we like to be, but that'll come soon enough. I am not going to do a big, long presentation on our congressman. Everybody knows him. Almost everybody loves you, Mike. And I think that the things that you have to talk about today are ever so much more important than your biography. So I would love you to just get right up here with the energy of a Idaho boy, and a Blackfoot Idaho boy in particular, and teach us what this crazy thing is you're working on. You can't breach no dams.
Thanks, Carol, for that wonderful introduction. It is good to be back. It's actually good to be back in person instead of doing everything by Zoom. This is a hard presentation to do by Zoom, believe it or not. But if I don't recognize you, it's because you got your mask on. I was just telling someone that it's kind of weird that we've got a whole class of freshman representatives in Congress that I wouldn't know if they took their masks off. So they walk around, I see them someplace else, and they say hi. I go, "Who are you?" And that's, fortunately, we've not had the spread of COVID in Congress, and hopefully we'll get past that. But I'm glad to talk to you a little bit about why I've kicked this hornet's nest. I think it's a hornet's nest that needed to be kicked. And basically, I saw a train wreck coming down the tracks. Admittedly, some people think I'm the train wreck, but I'm trying to solve a problem before it runs over the top of us. And believe me, it will if we don't do something about it. I want to tell you how I got to the point I am, and then we're going to go through a PowerPoint presentation. I say slideshow, but I guess that shows my age. You got to do PowerPoint presentations. So we're going to go through a PowerPoint presentation which will show you what is in the Columbia Basin Initiative. How I got to this is for the 9 or 10 years that I've either been chairman or ranking member of the Energy and Water Appropriations Committee, every president, whether it was Obama, whether it was Trump, whether it was Bush, has always recommended in their budget recommendation that one of three things. One, we sell the Bonneville Power Administration. Two, we sell their transmission. Or three, we allow rural electrics to buy power on the open market. Congress has never gone along with any of those things. Until a couple of years ago, about 3 or 4 years ago, some rural electrics came to me and said, we ought to be able to buy power on the open market. I'm going, how can that be? We all know Bonneville Power is the cheapest power you can get. Hydropower is easy to produce. It doesn't cost much to run water through dams, through turbines to produce the power. So how could it not be the cheapest power you can get? So we started investigating the Bonneville Power Administration, their finances, and their future. And I saw things like the director or the administrator of the BPA at the time said, "We are facing a severe financial challenge. We're not in a crisis mode yet, but it's coming very quickly." And I kept seeing these types of things. And then I found out that Bonneville Power Administration is not the cheapest power. That you can buy power on the open market cheaper than you can buy it from the Bonneville Power Administration. That was never the case in the past. And we started looking at the finances of the BPA and the challenges they face. A lot of it is all the ancillary costs we put on top of the Bonneville Power Administration. Every time somebody has a good idea, we'll just say, let the BPA pay for it. Whether it's weatherization programs in the Pacific Northwest, BPA pays for most of them. Whether it is the residential exchange rate, so that if you are an IOU customer like Idaho Power, your rates get reduced because Bonneville Power ratepayers pay you to reduce your rate. That was to spread the benefits of the hydropower across the entire region. You keep adding all these on, and then there is the fish mitigation costs. We have spent over the last 25 years $17 billion to restore salmon runs. The one thing it has not done is restore salmon runs. But that's $17 billion that the ratepayers have paid. And they are also always involved in litigation over the biops that come out, over the ESA, and other things. And we've spent millions and millions, both the Army Corps and the BPA, fighting off the lawsuits. In fact, the latest biop that came out last November, is already under challenge. And everybody believes that a judge will not hold up that biop. And then what's going to happen? That's the train wreck that's coming down the tracks. That's what I'm trying to avoid. So how do you make Bonneville Power Administration competitive into the future? First thing we said is you got to get some of the fish costs off of them and make them at a sustainable, constant level. Second thing you got to do is you got to end the salmon wars. That's the endless litigation that goes on forever. So we went to the people that are always involved in the lawsuits, the environmental groups, the tribes, and for some reason the state of Oregon's always involved, and said, what's it going to take to end these lawsuits? They said, you got to do whatever's necessary to save the salmon. So we started looking at the last 30 or 40 years of efforts to save salmon. What we came up with is everything that we can possibly try has been tried. I tell people that don't like our plan, if you've got another plan, if you've got another idea of how we can save these salmon runs, let me know. I'm not just some weird guy that wants to take out dams because it looks like fun. I'm trying to solve a problem. And it's one that's going to run over the top of us if we don't address it. And I came to the conclusion after studying this we've had probably in our office by this time, probably 600 meetings with everybody involved in this, whether it's resource groups, agricultural groups, environmental groups, the states of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and others. We've had more meetings than you'd care to count. And what I came up with is the only way you're going to save these salmon is to remove the lower four Snake River dams. And I knew that there would be, let's say, a little controversy when I proposed this last February, and that's okay, but this is a discussion that has to be had in the Pacific Northwest. Can we reimagine our future and design it ourselves, or will it be designed for us by someone else, usually a court? I think we're smart enough to do that. And so I put this plan forward, and we've been studying it. I will tell you that it is kind of interesting. One of the things that is, I've got a report here from 68 fish and wildlife biologists, fish biologists, that have signed on to it. They've got, most of the report is their credentials. And if you think they're just environmental attorneys or environmental fish biologists, you're wrong. This is the conclusions they came to. There's 4 of them. 1, the negative impacts of federal Columbia River power system, dams, and reservoirs on ESA-listed salmon are clearly and unequivocally impeding the recovery and restoration. Recovery of ESA-listed salmon and steelhead in the Snake River Basin cannot be accomplished without removing the dams on the lower Snake River, regardless of other environmental and management factors, including ocean conditions. And then the last one is, the actions set forth in the 2020 Federal Environmental Impact Statement and the BIOP, which is the one currently being challenged, are not sufficient and will not reverse salmon declines, much less rebuild populations to sustainable levels. This is the majority of the fish biologists in the Pacific Northwest. I'm not saying that, they are. So I came to the conclusion the only way you're going to restore salmon, Idaho's 4 salmon runs that are all on the endangered list, is to remove the lower Snake River dams. But that brought up the 4th question. Number 1 was, how do you save the BPA? Number 2 is, how do you end the salmon wars? 3, remove the dams. And the 4th one is, how do you compensate for the removal of the dams? And that's where it gets complicated, and that's where a lot of the Columbia Basin Initiative is focused on. Because we're the first organization, group, people, whatever, that put together this plan that recognizes that these dams have a value. In the past, when somebody wanted to remove dams, they've just said, let's take the dams out, without any consequences to what that implies. So we've spent a lot of time thinking of what the consequences are of removing these dams, and how do you compensate for those consequences. And they are substantial. And that's why it costs about $33.5 billion for this initiative. But again, I think it's something that's going to happen one way or another. Either we're going to design it or somebody's going to design it for us. Let's go through these slides. Then I will answer a couple questions and a few more things I want to say at the back and answer some questions. Are you ready? Oh, you can do it from right there? Technology is a wonderful thing, isn't it? This is the Columbia Basin Initiative, named by Nikki. She's the one that came up with the name of it. So it is, so I don't have to look behind me, I brought the slides with me. As I said, BPA is facing serious financial challenges. Agriculture and power companies are facing never-ending lawsuits. My example is, and most of those occur when there is a dam relicensing going on. That's when the lawsuits generally occur. Idaho Power has been trying to relicense the three Hells Canyon complex dams for over 25 years. They have spent 3 times as much relicensing the dams as it did to build the dams. That just seems crazy. But that's what happens. That's why those lawsuits always go on. And I will tell you, there are different types of environmental groups I've discovered. There are environmental groups that are actually concerned about the environment. And yeah, they sue and we get mad at them and all that kind of stuff. But there are environmental groups that make a living. It's a cottage industry after EJA funds. They are, I call them the extreme environmental groups, but they sue. They get paid if they win any or a portion of their lawsuit. They get paid by the federal government. Oftentimes, they get paid more than what it costs to file the lawsuit. So they have a business model here. Those are the types of different environmental groups we're dealing with. But we've got to end these salmon wars. Idaho's salmon and steelhead numbers are near extinction. There is no doubt about that. And they are headed toward extinction if we don't do something about it. This, in my opinion, is an opportunity to break the unsustainable status quo, because the status quo is truly unsustainable. We can end the salmon wars. Billions of dollars, I said, have been spent on failed mitigation and recovery plans. We can stop the never-ending lawsuits. I'll explain in a minute how we do that. And we can put people and fish. We can have both people and fish. Some people have said to me, well, if it comes down to people or fish, I choose people. Guess what? So do I. This is not about people and fish. That's not the question we're facing. We can have salmon recovery, and we can still have a sustainable growing economy in the Pacific Northwest. This is about more than just salmon and dams. This is an opportunity, as I said, to create our own path forward and invest in agriculture, clean energy, local economies, and much, much more. Let me explain what we do with agriculture. It's an opportunity to expand the infrastructure of agriculture. The investments in this comprehensive proposal would allow producers to affordably maintain our region's diverse agricultural industries through one, funding an animal nutrient management and development program, along with the University of Idaho. As you know, we've got water quality issues all across the Pacific Northwest, particularly down in the Magic Valley. Animal nutrient management is a big issue down there. We fund the research and development so that these individuals can clean the water, because we've got to have increased water quality if we're going to recover salmon. We also create a 25-year voluntary watershed program to improve and enhance water quality and temperature. If a farmer, after they develop their standards, if a farmer voluntarily decides to join that, they will be exempt from the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act for 25 years, if they follow that. That's the length of the program. So we get away from the lawsuits in that regard. We also have to replace the transportation. We have to improve the grain transportation network. That doesn't affect southern Idaho much, but it affects northern Idaho, where they take most of their grain and ship it down barge it down the Columbia River, Lower Snake and Columbia River, to Portland. So we have to improve that grain transportation network and improve the port facilities. We have to improve the rail and port development in the Tri-Cities and Lewiston, Clarkston, and enhance the commodity transportation system, and reconfigure the irrigation in Washington, where they take water out of the Lower Snake River to irrigate their wheat crops. I've always found it interesting that we send a whole bunch of water, I'll talk about it in a minute, down the Snake River to flush salmon over the dams, and it keeps the pools behind the dams at a high level so that Washington irrigators can pull that water out and irrigate their crops in Washington. But that's 487,000 acre feet that we can't use in Idaho. We lose it. But it sustains them. Now they will tell you, well, it's just pass through water. We have to pass it through to flush salmon. The one thing it's not done is recover salmon. But the reality is if those pools were not kept high and they had to flush water that is there, that water would go down substantially. You wouldn't have barging, and they would have a hard time pumping out of those pools. It is almost a misnomer to call the Lower Snake River a river. It's not a river anymore. It's a series of pools behind dams that increase predation of salmon, increase water temperature to unhealthy levels for salmon, and if the temperature of the water gets above about 68 degrees, you're in trouble. I think you're going to see that this year. But that's the challenges that you face. Now the question is, can you replace the power? Everybody says to me, what are you going to do about the power? Those 4 dams they have the potential to produce about 3,000 megawatts of power. They produce, on average, around 900,000, something like that, on an ongoing basis. You're going to have to replace that power, and that's firm power. So you're going to have to replace it with firm power. When those dams were built, they were built primarily for power. When the first dam was authorized in 1945, the Army Corps kept asking for funding to build a dam, or to build Ice Harbor, the first one you come to coming up the river. And the Appropriations Committee in the House would never fund it. 1953, they asked the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, a guy named Cannon from Missouri, why he wouldn't fund this request from the Army Corps of Engineers. His answer was, once you start building those dams, it will mean the extinction of a species, and that's something we cannot comprehend, and only God can bring it back. Pretty perceptive of this guy in 1953. And then a couple of senators slipped in a rider on an appropriation bill for the first $1 million to start Ice Harbor, and that started the dam building in the Lower Snake River. But you can replace the power, and the reason they did Ice Harbor was for power for Hanford. We needed it for national defense purposes. When they decided to do that, and they needed the power, there's only 2 ways at the time really to produce power. You either did it through hydro, or you built a coal-fired plant. They decided to do hydro. Made sense. But today there are multiple ways of replacing that power. You can do it through things like pump storage. You can do it through battery technology, and they tell me you're going to be amazed over the next several years of what happens with batteries. You can do it through small modular reactors that are being developed out here at the site. Pop down a couple 6-packs of an SMR in Hanford, and you've replaced the power. It's not hard to replace the power with firm power. You can do that. That's not the issue. That's actually the easy part of it, but the more expensive part. It costs about $10 billion in this proposal for the BPA to replace that power, and the replacement power has to be in place before any dam would come out. And we create, because this obviously has an impact on Lewiston, that's something we can't ignore, we create a Snake River Center for Advanced Energy Storage that's co-located with the Pacific Northwest Laboratory and at Hanford and the Lewiston-Clarkston Research Technology Campus. And then we also have to put a couple $1 billion into increasing the transmission capabilities of the BPA. Because every power company will tell you, whatever you do in this, you've got to make sure you maintain the transportation capabilities, because they use those lines for transportation of power, whether it's Idaho Power or any other power company. So we've got to improve the transportation capabilities of the BPA. That's $2 billion. What are the benefits for the Bonneville Power Administration? We increase the borrowing cap. This is one of the financial challenges that BPA is facing. They're hitting up against their borrowing cap right now of $7.7 billion from the federal treasury. We increase it to $15 billion, but we take a lot of the fish mitigation costs off of the BPA and cap it at $600 million a year. We create a new fish and wildlife organization that's represented by the 4 states and 4 different tribes so that they have an equal representation. They're in charge of managing fish, and they will get the $600 million a year to do that. I've always thought it was a little bit of a conflict to have the BPA and the what's his name committee, the The what? Yeah, Northwest Power Planning Council, an arm of the BPA, to be in charge of producing power and also saving fish. That's kind of a contradiction. We want to take that out of the BPA and put it into some true fish management where they know that they have this $600 million a year to do mitigation efforts and other types of things. It will, as I said, it will remove those direct costs on the BPA. So that's what we do for the BPA. It's kind of interesting that some people have said, well, you know, the BPA said this year they have $147 million profit. How can they be facing financial crisis? It works like this. They keep borrowing money for the Treasury. They have never missed a Treasury payment. But you know how they make the Treasury payment? They extend out their debt. This is a little bit like paying your mortgage with your credit card and then saying you're paying down your mortgage. But your debt keeps going up. And that's the problem with them. It's easy to show that you've made a profit, but not if you look at the whole picture. And that's the financial challenges that they're facing. And that's what we're trying to relieve them of. As I said, we increased their borrowing authority to $15 billion, which is about double. In this infrastructure bill that just passed the other day in the Senate, there's a provision in there to increase the borrowing authority by $10 billion. More than double it. And I asked myself, okay, if you're so financially sound, do you really need that $10 billion? That's the question. Now, what of the state of Snake River salmon? Over the past 30 years, as I said, more than $17 billion has been spent on failed fish recovery efforts. More salmon and steelhead are listed under the Endangered Species Act today than in 1980. That's how successful we've been. Today, all Snake River salmon and steelhead are listed as threatened or endangered. The next map is, I think, the most important, this one. The way you measure the health of a salmon run is what's called their SARS, smolt to adult ratio. That's the number of adults that come back per smolts that go down the river. You need to have, you would preferably like to have a rate between 4 and 6. That's a good, healthy, sustainable, harvestable population. If it's above 2, it's sustainable. Not really growing, but it's sustainable. If it gets below 2, you're headed toward extinction. When these dams, when these fish decide to come back in the mouth of the Columbia out here, they all come in, they go over 3 dams, the first 3 on the lower Columbia, and then the fish that go back to their spawning grounds on the John Day drainage take a right turn and go up to John Day. Their SARS rate is about 3.5. Good, healthy population. Fish that go over the 4th dam and go up the Yakima Valley, their return rate is about 2.4. You'd like to see it higher, but it's still sustainable and growing. Then Idaho's fish take a right turn and go up the Snake River, where they have to cross 4 more dams. After they cross that last dam, the SARS rate is about 0.9 to 0.8. That's a path toward extinction. And you got to remember, those fish that went over the 4 dams on the lower Columbia have gone through the same ocean conditions, the same predators, the same other factors that the other fish that have a much higher rate, much higher SARS rate have gone through. So why do Idaho's salmon have such a low SARS rate and headed toward extinction? It's because they got 4 more dams to go over. So every fish biology will tell you, I mean, you know, you can get by 1 dam, 2 dams, maybe 3 dams, 4 dams, but eventually there's too damn many dams. And that's what's happening with Idaho salmon. That's why fish biologists will tell you the only way you're going to restore them is to remove the 4 lower Columbia dams. We can end the salmon wars, at least put a moratorium on them. This concept would lock in, for a 35-year period, all the licensing of the remaining dams in the Pacific Northwest. Some environmental groups don't like that, some of the ones that use EJA funds, because that would kind of take away their right to sue when you do licensing under the Clean Water, or the Endangered Species and NEPA process. If there's other issues, they can sue under those, but under those provisions, which is what they usually sue under, they would be prevented from filing lawsuits for that period of time while we're trying to restore salmon. Is that for me? Yeah. Good. Just a second, I need some water. Like I say, it would end that litigation for 35 years, and these are the dams. Are you going, Nikki? Get off your phone. These are the dams that would be relicensed for 35 years. That's all the remaining dams in the Pacific Northwest that produce more than 5 megawatts of power. That would end the salmon wars. I'm not saying there would never be another lawsuit. There might be under some other circumstances. But that would end the salmon wars, as far as I'm concerned, for a period where we can actually try and recover the salmon. What do we do when we remove the dams? We don't go in and blow up the cement and drag them out. We remove the earthen berms. That takes about $1.4 billion. We have to do some sediment mitigation because you don't want to wash all that sediment down the river. That's about $400 million. We restore the lower Snake River lower Snake River corridor, and the lower Snake River corridor road and rail system mitigation, $300 million on that. As I said, we improve water quality by a watershed partnership, which is about $3 billion, because it's not just the lower Snake, it's other areas also, whether it's in the Willamette or the John Day or the Yakima, or actually in the Puget Sound also. You getting on to my next one? Okay. We also invest in communities because removing these has an impact on some communities. We do $150 million for waterfront restoration in Lewiston. You remember Lewiston's got a port. About a $1.9 million budget and about 7 full-time employees. They're going to be affected. So you have to do something with the Lewiston-Clarkston waterfront restoration. We have, as I said, the Snake River Center for Advanced Energy Storage, $125 billion. Economic Development and Compensation Fund, $875 million, because you have recreation people in those all the way down the Columbia River, or the lower Snake River, that you'd have to deal with. But as I said, this is an opportunity to create our own path forward. I think it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to do it, and we can make a more secure and prosperous and sustainable Northwest future. Let me address a couple of the questions that I'm frequently asked about this. If you study the history of salmon, from what happened in England and Ireland, how they lost their salmon runs about 200 years ago, 100 years ago in the Atlantic coast, how they lost their salmon runs. It's the same debate that's happening right now. Factors might be different, but it's essentially the same debate. And the problem is there's so many things you can point to and say, it's not the dams, it's the ocean conditions. Ocean conditions do affect them. It's not the ocean conditions, it's the predators. So you can always point to something else. But as the fish biologist said, even if all of those things were perfect, you still wouldn't restore the salmon runs in the lower Snake River. That's just the reality. There is what's called a Pacific Northwest oscillation that occurs in the ocean. Been occurring forever. Warm water comes up from the south, salmon go further north because they're cold water, and then that oscillation reverses itself and it goes south and salmon come back. So people will say, well, listen, even those rivers that don't have salmon or that don't have dams in them, Fraser River in Canada is one they always point to, salmon runs are down. That's true. But salmon runs are going from here to here on the Fraser River. In Idaho, they're going from here to here. That's the challenge we face. Predators, we're trying to take care of predators, but guess what? When you got these pools that now take a smolt 10 times as long to get to the ocean as they used to on a free-flowing river, they're more susceptible to predators, and in those pools behind the dams, they're really susceptible to predators. So you've got to reduce that. We're trying to do that. We're trying to address all those problems. But as I said, you can always point to something else that's causing it. The thing that this is the one that I'm having trouble with. Excuse me, I'm a little warm. This is the one I'm having just a little bit of trouble with. When I look at my district, southern part of Idaho and eastern Idaho, it seems to me like we pay all the costs of the dams and we get very little of the benefit, if any. We lose our salmon runs, which is an economic loss, plus it's just the wrong thing to do. And we send 487,000 acre-feet of water down the river to flush salmon that are not recovering salmon. That's 487,000 acre-feet of water we can't use in southern Idaho. We can't use it to recharge our aquifer, which is being depleted. We can't use it for irrigation or other purposes. We just flush it down the river. That's a huge cost to us. Can we get that water back? I think so. But when I talk to people, they kind of say that they think they're going to lose some benefit from removal of those dams. A, we can replace the power. You know how much power we get from those Bonneville dams now? Or from those dams on the lower Columbia or lower Snake River? About 8% comes to all of Idaho. That's not much. We can repair those. The 4 dams that need to be replaced, they are Ice Harbor, Lower Monumental, Little Goose, Lower Granite Dams. Some people say you're trying to take dams out in Idaho. Actually, these are in Washington. But they are affecting, obviously, Idaho salmon. What happens if we just fight? You know, the history of conflict and resolution of conflict is that there's a point where you could reach an agreement when both sides think they're going to win. But what generally happens is they keep fighting and one side loses and the other side wins. So you got a loser and a winner. Whether it's a decision by a court or some other method. What happened in the Spotted Owl in Oregon? Resource people over there, all of these Oregon towns used to have lumber mills throughout it. And you remember the Spotted Owl fights? Resource people were told, if you just keep fighting, we'll win this. Guess what? Spotted Owl won. And a lot of those communities no longer have the timber mills in their local communities. In fact, most of them. In the Klamath Basin, there are 4 dams on the Klamath River, privately owned by Pacific Corp. They came to an agreement with the environmentalists, the tribes, and the agricultural community. They were going to remove the dams. The Indians were going to give their water rights to agriculture, which is unheard of. They never do that. They were going to give their water rights to agriculture, and they were going to get in return about 200,000 acres of timberland to manage. They brought that to Congress, and Congress refused to pass it because it had dam removal in it. Today, those 4 dams are coming out, and nobody's being compensated for it. I don't want that to happen to us. That's why I'm trying to stop this train wreck that I see coming down the road. Let's see if I can answer any questions that you might have.
Mike, I've gotten a few questions, and some of them are about Washington, D.C. and things that are going on there, but I want to follow on the theme of the breaching first. So I'm going to ask some of those questions first. Can you summarize for us just really shortly, really quickly? This is what I'm picking up from your presentation. Problems. Lewiston, replacing power, transporting our grain, irrigating for some of those folks. Have I got them all? I mean, those seem like the biggest ones. Am I right on that?
Yep,
Okay.
that's right.
So just quickly, Lewiston will just completely change from a port city to a research city.
Yep, it won't have, I mean, you're going to have to replace the impacts and the advantage that they have from barging. Now, I understand the grain growers in North Idaho. They're concerned for this because barging is the cheapest way to get grain down the river to Portland. The question is, can we make it so that they can get it down as cheaply or cheaper? We've got a plan in here that I think would work to get it down cheaper, than it currently goes down the river. And that would be, we would put $3.6 billion in a transportation system. They could actually put that in the U.S. Treasury for the next 9 years before the dams came out, that have about $5 billion. That'd be about $200 million a year in interest without touching the principal. That's more than they spend right now transporting the grain down the river. So some of my grain farmers down south are saying, wow, that's way too generous. But they need to design the system themselves that works for them. And we need to make sure they have the resources to increase the infrastructure to be able to do that. People will tell you that, well, you're going to take this barge traffic, which, by the way, is subsidized transportation. The maintenance of those 4 dams, maintenance and operation costs are about $2 million a year. They don't pay a lockage fee when they ship grain down the river. The barges don't. They pay a gas tax that goes into, or a diesel tax that goes into the Inland Waterway Trust Fund. But that doesn't nearly cover what it costs to maintain those dams and so forth. So it is subsidized transportation. They recognize that. But I'm sitting here and I talk to my grain growers, and this is one of the biggest opponents of what I'm doing so far. The grain growers in southern Idaho don't barge their grain. They don't ship it to Lewiston to barge their grain. They put it on a truck and they take it to Ogden, where it's milled in Ogden. So what benefit are my grain growers in my district getting from this? When I talk to them about it, they say, well, we support our brothers up in northern Idaho. I think that's great. The problem is we lose 487,000 acre feet of water that you could use down here. They don't care about water. That's dry land farm up there. So it doesn't bother them that they lose water because they don't. They don't really care about power rates because they don't pump. As our grain farmers do down here, we're at a huge competitive disadvantage. And then you go to Washington and we subsidize their grain growing by shipping our water to fill those pools behind the dam so that they can pump it out and grow grain and compete against us. Does this make sense? I don't think so. Those are some of the things that got me going on this puppy. But yes, grain growing in Lewiston is the big issue. And I recognize you can't just walk away from Lewiston. It's an important community, and they do some great things up there, and we're trying to make sure that Lewiston and Clarkston has some resources for a different economic future.
Went to school at the University of Idaho, and there isn't much room on either side of the gorge for more railroad tracks, so we're not going to be able to ship it by rail.
Well, one of the things is I looked at maps and stuff, and I'm not a transportation expert. I'm not a energy expert. I'm not a fish biologist or any of those kind of things. What I am pretty good is listening to people. And you look at the routes. Does grain really need to go to Lewiston to be put on a train or a truck? Or would it be better going to Pullman and down to Lewiston? And down to the Tri-Cities, where it could be loaded on barges. We actually would increase the barge traffic on the lower Columbia River with this proposal. So it's the biggest problem we're facing right now is this involves change. And people hate change. I hate change. I like to know that the sun's going to pretty much come up tomorrow where it did today. It would bother me if I had to walk outside and look where it was. Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that men are more disposed to suffer evils while sufferable than to right themselves and correct the problem. That's true. We just don't like change. One guy said to me, well, why do you want to upset a system that's working? I said, it might be working for you. It sure as hell ain't working for salmon. And those fish will go extinct. I can't make that point, I can't emphasize that enough. Now, some of my colleagues say, well, we need more science. We've been studying, there have been 25 collaborative groups studying salmon and how to restore salmon over the years. I don't know of something that we haven't tried. But I tell them, if you've got another idea that has a reasonable chance of success, let me know. As I said, I don't want to go take out dams just because it looks like fun. I want to restore salmon runs. I know of no other way to do it. Even the Army Corps of Engineers in their 2000 biop and in their 2020 biop, both times said the surest way to recover salmon is to remove the dams. Highest probability of recovering salmon is to remove the dams. But then they said, well, we can't recommend that because we don't have the money and we don't have the authority. So that's not part of the biop, which is one of the reasons that a judge is going to look at that and go, psh, and throw it out. And then what do you do? When they came in to brief me on the new biop, the Army Corps and BPA, they sat down and it's called a variable flex flow. And I looked at them and said, well, two things. One, is this going to increase or decrease the time that it takes a smolt to get down the river? Because that's one of the big challenges facing them. And they said, well, no. And I said, is it going to recover Idaho salmon runs? And they said, no, we see this as a bridge to a final solution. I said, what? I said, what's that final solution? And they just kind of looked at me. I said, come on, guys, you know what the final solution is. You're just afraid to say it. That's the reality. That's what we're facing. But the biggest challenge is we don't like to change things. So, and I understand that. I really do. That's why I haven't been too critical of some of my friends and colleagues. I love it when they say, you know, we can't take those dams out. Dan Newhouse and Kathy McMorris Rogers, the dams are in their district. I understand why they're opposed to them. I really do. I have kept them briefed on everything we have been doing several times. In fact, before I released our concept in February, I had Dan over to my office and said, this is what we're doing tomorrow. Showed him the video, everything we were going to do. They have been fully briefed on everything we've done and who we've been talking to. But they will say, I don't want to, I'm going to fight you all the way to not remove the dams, but I want salmon back as much as anybody does. What they generally mean, and I think they're sincere, what they generally mean is that I want salmon back as long as I don't have to change anything I'm currently doing. But what we're currently doing is leading to extinction. Go ahead, Carol.
Two more questions on the salmon issue, if you don't mind. Can it be worked into your plan, the infrastructure bill that they're working on right now? Might that be the way that it gets paid for? And
we originally started this, well, we didn't originally start it. Last January when Biden got elected and they started talking about an infrastructure package. They got the $1 billion one to pass the House, or the $1 trillion to pass the House, or pass the Senate. Now Nancy has called us back into session a week after next, so we'll be going back for that. I shouldn't say Nancy. Speaker Pelosi has called us back a week after next. And then they're looking at a $3.5 trillion social infrastructure package, whatever that is. We thought, you know, we won't be ready with legislation. It would take us a year to write the legislation because it is so complicated. But if we could get the money put aside into an account for the Columbia Basin Initiative, and then let us write the legislation, talk with people, it would change as we went along, as people brought up different issues and that kind of stuff. And then the money would be there, but it couldn't be spent unless Congress passed a salmon recovery plan. You know, Earl Blumenauer, a Democrat from Portland, good friend of mine, he's all on board with me, and he doesn't agree with everything we're doing on it, but he knows that there's a path forward and we've got to find it. I expected to get more support out of Jay Inslee, the governor of Washington, and Patty Murray, and some of the other of my Democratic friends in Washington. They're really nervous. And they didn't want to put the money into this account because they're afraid that it would look like they were endorsing a Republican's plan. Yeah, that would be horrible. I said, listen, take my name off it. I don't care. All I want is salmon back. And so they've now, Jay and Patty Murray are going to start another collaborative and come up with a proposal. From what I understand, it's going to be much like what we're proposing, but it'll be the Murray-Inslee plan. Fine with me. I don't care. But if you haven't noticed over the years, politicians are generally averse to risk. We don't like to make a tough decision if we don't have to. This is a tough decision for everyone. And I've had a lot of my friends come up on both the Republican and Democratic side that have said, I like what you're doing, but I can't publicly support it right now because my constituents aren't there. I said, hell, you think my constituents are? You know? I mean, it's one of those things, and that's why we didn't release a piece of legislation. Because that implies you're ready to go. You got this thing, you've worked out all the problems, and you're ready to pass this piece of legislation. What we wanted is a discussion in the Pacific Northwest. Because this needs to be a decision that all of us make. And understand we're not going to all agree on it, but ultimately we're going to decide our future or somebody's going to decide it for us. Change is coming whether we like it or not. I was going to say one other thing that I forgot to earlier. I got off on a tangent, as I typically do. One of the things that they will say, and Newhouse and McMorris-Rogers say this, well, you're going to take that barging out, and then you're going to put that grain on trucks and trains, which put more carbon into the air, which increases climate change. So are you really doing any good? I've been talking with major truck manufacturers and also with the railroads. I don't know that in 10 years, 15 years, you're going to see many diesel trucks on the road anymore. They're going to battery powered. That's the change that's just coming, whether we want it or not. It's what's going to happen. Same is true with trains. They're going to hydrogen power and to battery power. The problem with a truck right now is the initial investment is very high. It's kind of like buying a Tesla. The initial investment is pretty high. Once you get it, the operating cost over the life of a truck is about 50% of a battery truck than it is with a diesel truck. So, I mean, these guys are looking at economics, saying, hey, and that initial investment's going to come down. So I don't think it's an issue that you're going to put more carbon into the air, because these dams don't come out for 9 years in our proposal. 2030 is the first time it removes, because there's a lot of preliminary work to do. You got to remove all the sediment behind these dams. That's dredging. That's going to take some time, because you can't just wash all that sediment down the river.
There may be some who question.
Some what?
Some people question the true value of the salmon. And so to put it in a really simple term, what is it about the salmon that is so important? What if it just goes?
There are some people, you won't find many that say it out loud, is just let them go extinct and this problem goes away. I think that's wrong. I think we have both a moral and a legal obligation. We should not allow a species to go extinct if the reason it's going extinct is because of our activities, and we can change those activities. You got to remember, everything we do on the Lower Snake and Columbia River, everything we do can be done differently if we choose to do it differently. That's our choice. Salmon don't have a choice. They need a river. And right now they don't have one. We also have legal obligations. Every Native American tribe that signed a treaty with the United States government reserved their fishing rights at their place of traditional fishing. Those treaty rights don't mean a lot if our activities have killed all the fish and there's no fish there to fish for. I was at an orca salmon summit that the tribes put on in Seattle, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago. You ought to listen to the stories of these tribes and what salmon mean to them. I realized at the time, and I told them, we're fighting for the same objectives. We want to save salmon. I want to do it because I think it's the right thing to do, and they're iconic species in the Pacific Northwest. It's different with them. It's their culture, it's their heritage, it's their religion. This is what a salmon goes through in Idaho. High mountain streams up by Stanley, Idaho, they get spawn. They hatch. They swim around for maybe a year. And then something clicks. Says, I think I'll go on vacation. And they get flushed down the river. Interesting, and it's important to note, they get flushed down the river. They don't swim down the river. They're actually headed upstream, facing upstream as they're getting flushed down the river. So they need a current. They get flushed down the river. Then they go over 4 dams on the Lower Snake. Now, people will say these are the most fish-friendly dams and turbines that there are. They will say we get between 95 and between 90 and 95% passage of salmon. That means you only lose maybe 10% at each dam. So they go over those 4 dams. Then they enter the Columbia River. They go over 4 more dams. They go through all the predators on their way down. And then amazingly, they change from a freshwater fish to a saltwater fish. That's amazing to start with. Then they go out to the ocean and they get the nutrients and they grow and they become salmon. Then after 3, 4, or 5 years, something clicks in their brain and says, hey, I think it's time to go home. So they find the mouth of the Columbia River. They go through the predators. They change from a saltwater fish back to a freshwater fish. Go over 8 dams, swim 850 miles up this river, gain 1.25 miles in altitude. Why? To lay their eggs and die. I got to tell you, that's a life cycle only God could create. Maybe we shouldn't mess with it.
And with that, I would like to insert a little commercial for my friend Chris Milgate. Chris, will you stand up so everybody knows who you are? And then you can talk to her afterwards if you'd like. Tomorrow, Chris has put together a documentary called Ocean to Idaho. It is a world premiere, and it is the first time it's ever been documented a fish from the ocean that does make it back to Idaho. And Chris followed the fish for an entire season. The premiere is tomorrow night from 7 to 10 p.m. at the Colonial Theater here in Idaho Falls. $10 to get in and watch. And you would be able to see the passion that Mike describes these fish in living color through Chris's lens. It is a match made in heaven, and you will learn everything you need to know about this topic. So I highly invite all of you to attend tomorrow night, 7 o'clock, Colonial Theater, $10. All right, that's the end of my little commercial. Are you ready for some, Washington, D.C. type questions?
Yeah, that's just an exciting place right now.
I know, it's a happening. So there's quite a few people that were a little bit upset that you signed on with Texas. Back when in the days where all the Republicans were standing together.
Amicus brief?
Yes. And I mean, people that have been big supporters of you, big contributors, were just shocked, and I might say hurt that
let
you
me
did that.
put it this way. I voted to certify the election. The reason I voted to certify the election is because I don't think Congress has the right to overturn a state certified election. if the Secretary of State submits the list of the slate of candidates to be electors, who am I to say, no, that's not right, we don't like that list? If a state had, and their, say the Secretary of State and the legislature had submitted two different lists, then Congress would have a choice to make. Maybe to either certify neither one or to certify or to choose one of them. I don't know. All we're there for is to count. That's the reason. Now, Trump challenged the election in I don't know how many multiple courts, and they rejected him, including the Supreme Court. Then I voted for the January 6th Commission, because it was originally, Speaker Pelosi said she's going to put together this committee and it's going to be 14 Democrats, 7 Republicans. She was going to choose the staff, and it was going to, they would have subpoena power. And we said, no, if you're going to do a commission, it's going to be equally divided, and the staff will be chosen by both parties, and they'll both have subpoena power, or it takes a majority plus one. So you'd have to have, each side would have to agree to a subpoena. We sent in a guy named Katko from New York, Congressman Katko, to negotiate. He came out with exactly what we wanted. And then for some reason, our leadership turned against it and said, no, vote against it. I said, that's crazy. Because if you do, what you're going to end up with is what we got right now, and that's a partisan committee. And the results are not going to be believed by some and believed by others. So I voted for the January 6th Commission, which has got some of my conservatives upset with me. The reason I signed on to the amicus brief from the Texas, I can't remember how many Republicans signed on to it, but I signed on to it for one reason. Steny Hoyer, we were on the floor, and he came up to me and he said, hey, Mike, come here. And Steny's a good friend of mine. He's the Democratic Majority Leader from Maryland, good guy. But he said, got me over in the corner, he says, why the hell did you sign on to that amicus brief? He said, I looked down the list of them. He says, most of them I understand. I said, I didn't understand why you signed on to it. I said, it wasn't because I thought the Supreme Court would overturn the decision, overturn the election. I mean, what the hell would they do if they overturned it? Say, hold another election? They're not going to do that. I said, I didn't have any thought that they would overturn it, and I think it would be wrong if they did. But there is a question that needs to be answered. As you know, there is some things that happen in elections that everybody points as fraud and everything. I don't think fraud was the reason that Trump lost this election. Was there some that went on? Yeah. It always goes on to some degree. There was probably more this time because of the unusual circumstances of this election. But the Constitution says elections are conducted under laws established by the state legislatures. That's what the Constitution says. Not by the governors, not by the secretaries of state, not by a judge. They're conducted under laws established by the state legislatures. And we had multiple cases where it was the Secretary of State that changed the election laws, or the governor changed the election laws without consulting the legislature. To me, that's clearly going against what the Constitution says. I think we need that question answered moving forward. And that's what I wanted the Supreme Court to answer, is what does that part of the Constitution mean? Now, I understand why they did it. This is a weird election with COVID going on, and I understand that they had to extend voting hours and places and all that kind of stuff. But if I was the governor of Idaho and I had to go through that, I would have called in the legislature and said, hey, we got to change the laws here. We're not going to be able to get this election done. So that's the only question I wanted answered. Not that I thought the Supreme Court would overturn the election. Maybe that's a good excuse, maybe it's not.
What is your specific reason for voting against the For the People Act, securing voting rights for all eligible voters? And this particular question says, I'm not asking for talking points from the Republican Party, but your very own personal justification for voting against this act.
The reason I voted against it is because I don't want the federal government taking over our elections. I mean, that's about as blunt as you can get. And believe me, the federal government would take over the elections. They would make ballot harvesting legal in all 50 states. Right now, it's only legal in California. Do you know what ballot harvesting is? It's where you go out and you give all these people ballots or mail them out to or whatever, and then anybody can go out and gather those ballots and take them back. So I can go out and gather ballots, and you got a sign for Biden in your front yard. Whoops, I don't know where that ballot went, and turn them in. You don't have to be registered. We had an amendment. This happened in California where after the election of, not this last one, but 2 years ago, after the election, Republicans had won 14 seats of the 53. And after they counted the harvested ballots, they lost 7 of those 14 seats. They won on the same day, they won on mail-in, they won on everything except the ballot harvested ballots. We had an amendment in the Approach Committee. Said, okay, if you're going to ballot harvest, we realize that we're never going to get an amendment through to make that illegal like it is in most states. At least, let's say that if you are going to gather ballots and turn them in, you have to be a United States citizen. They voted against it. So you can be a Chinese citizen, you can be a student from Iran, you can go out and affect our elections. That doesn't make sense to me. I want every person who's qualified to vote to vote. And I want to make it as easy as possible for them to vote. But I do not want the federal government taking over elections. There would also be a thing in there where they would fund political campaigns. I don't know that I want my tax money going to fund somebody's political campaign. That's why I voted against it. But it has a good name. For the People is really a good name.
It's all about marketing.
Yeah.
Marketing and branding. Do you think our democracy is in peril?
Yes.
Would you like to expand on that?
You know, I've been one of the most optimistic guys in the world, saying that we've been through tougher times than this, and we have been. The Great Depression, you look at the Civil War, World War I, World War II, other times. I just saw a PBS program on the year 1968, which happens to be the year I graduated from high school, which was, you know, a really strange year in politics. You had all the riots going on, the Democratic convention, you know, we thought the world was coming apart, and it was to some degree. And I've always thought, you know, we've gotten through this. And we're stronger when we do. But this country is so divided. Not just those of us in Congress, but the public out here. We are all very divided. And the biggest challenge we face is, how do you know whether the information you're getting is accurate? Most people get their news off the internet. I actually had a guy call me and say, well, you know, he was on a radio program. He says, you know, you get your salary. He was complaining about Congress. He says, you know, you get your salary for the rest of your life after you served 1 day. I said, is that true? And he said, yeah. I said, well, geez, why would I serve 2 days? He said, I hadn't really thought about that. I said, where'd you hear that? He says, I got it over the internet. And you know, they wouldn't let him put it on the internet if it wasn't true. There are people that believe that. So how do you judge the value and the accuracy of the information that you're getting? If you're watching Fox News and that's it, you're only getting one perspective. If you're watching MSNBC and that's it, you're only getting one perspective. I've actually come to a meeting, been at a meeting, and got home that night and turned on the TV, and I won't tell you the program or channel that it was on. But they're reporting on this meeting that was going on. I'm sitting there listening to that going, huh, that sounds pretty interesting. I didn't realize till the end of the report that that's the meeting I was at. So how do you know what you're getting, and how does the public, how can they trust the information that they're getting? I think that's one of the biggest challenges we face. One day, what's his name? Ken Burns, that did the Civil War series, you know, on PBS. Great documentary maker and stuff. He was in my office, and we were talking. And this was a few years after his his Gettysburg series, Civil War series came out. And he said, you know, I got a phone call from Shelby Foote. If you don't know who Shelby Foote is, he was an author from the South, wrote a bunch of books on the Civil War. He's got a great 3-volume series on the Civil War. And it's interesting because it's from a different perspective. Not that it was pro-South or anything, but it's from a different perspective. And he said, Shelby Foote called me and said, Kenny, I want to thank you for making me a rich man. And Ken said, what do you mean? He says, after your Civil War series came out, he said, the sales of my books just went through the roof. He said, all of a sudden I'm rich. Then they talked for a while, and Ken said, how did we ever get in a situation in this country where we had state fighting state, family fighting family, brother fighting brother on opposite sides of a civil war? 700,000 Americans dead. How did we ever get to that situation? He says, Shelby told him that, says, this is the most diverse country in the world. If there's a race, a religion, an ethnicity, a political, economic philosophy anywhere in the world, you'll find it represented somewhere here in this country. And we have always been great at compromise. We can get together and find solutions. Said, but when we stopped compromising, we started shooting one another. I think about it a lot. And when I see what's happening today in our cities, not pretty. Something's got to change.
That note, I think it's probably a good time to wrap it up. Mike has still got, legally by our contract, 5 more minutes availability. And so he'll come back down and be up front here. If you had a specific question that wasn't addressed, do come and ask him. And Mike, can't thank you enough for coming. You are, as I said, we go back a long ways. Yep. And I still, although I don't have the power of the news behind me anymore, when I call, I expect you to remember that.
I appreciate it. Thank you. And the other thing, let me just say, is that I will answer the first question I asked is, why did I kick this hornet's nest? I think the reason that you elect someone is if they see a problem coming to try to address it. That's all I'm trying to do. So I hope you guys will at least sit back and think about what I've said today. And are there alternatives? If there are, let me know. Appreciate it. Thanks for the City Club.